So I've been online for some time, being a child of the 90s. And, there's a lot of things that keep popping up that, you just, as Jamie Tart says, is poopy. But I have seen four things when it pertains to cinematography or filmmaking adjacent stuff that are complete myths, but keep popping up, not just on YouTube, but on TikTok, Twitter, whatever. And so I just wanted to go through them and do a little bit of myth busting because I think it's important. And of course, I just sneezed like crazy, so it's gonna look like I was crying through this whole thing. All right, so the first one is that log equals better color. It doesn't. Log is an encoding gamma curve that gives you better dynamic range. It's the gamut, the color gamut that you use that gives you potentially better color. Now, recording color and recording light are, of course, somewhat intertwined, but log as a format gives you better dynamic range, allows you to see more into the highlights, more into the shadows than your camera would normally encode or that a display gamma shows. But it's the cine gamut usually that is what's giving you the better range of color. So there's this little triangular chart called the CIE chromaticity chart. And it's basically showing you all visible colors. And with something like Rec 709, it's a small circle of triangle actually of colors. And then with whatever, Adobe wide gamut or DaVinci wide gamut or Rec 2020, whatever, bigger triangles, right? And actually that brings up something. When we say Rec 709, that's actually half the equation. It's Rec 709 gamma 2.4. Rec 709 is not a gamma curve. It's a color space. So it's actually best practices to record more information than you're going to deliver at the end of the day. This is also why we tend to want to shoot higher resolution. So 4K for a 1080 deliverable, 6 or 8K for a 4K deliverable, just because, best case scenario, you're just super sampling. You'll get a cleaner image when you shot big and then it gets small. But, you also obviously have the room for reframing and stabilization. But the same applies to your color space and your tone curve, your gamma curve. So, if your final deliverable is going to be Rec 709 gamma 2.4, which is 99% of the stuff that I think anyone watching this video will be delivering in, you want to record in, let's say, Rec 2020, like the Fujifilm X-T3 that I have, F-Log, if we're using the Fujifilm as the example. Rec 2020 being the color space, F-Log being the gamma curve. F-Log gives us more dynamic range. You can see more into the shadows, more to the highlights. Rec 2020, bigger chunk of the chromaticity chart. I shoot C-Log to cinema gamut a lot on my Canon cameras. Not a lot, always. RE log C with RE wide gamut, all those things. But you could theoretically shoot C log 2 Rec 709, right? You could. It would just be silly. Second thing, slightly related, a color space transform in Resolve or whatever program you're using doesn't make your camera a different camera. So I'll see a lot of people say like, oh, use a color space transform from your camera to RE log C Adobe wide gamut or RE log wide gamut, RE log C RE wide gamut, and your camera will have Alexa colors or will look Alexa. And that is not the case. Think of it this way. The RE sensor sees color in a certain way. Every camera sees colors and light in a certain way. And that's mapped, let's say, on that chromaticity chart, XY coordinates, boop. If the Alexa sees color at this point and the camera you're using sees that same color over here, transforming them, they're going to just stay Here, you know, this isn't it, your camera's not suddenly going to remap that color, you know what you intended and remap that color. So that's when I see a lot. Oh, just use a color space transform and you'll, you know, now you'll have RE colors. That's not how that works. You will be working in the color space that RE cameras are designed for, but your colors will not be shifted to look like an Alexa. If you took your camera and an Alexa and used a color space transform on yours to get into log C RE wide gamut and then transform them both into 709 2.4, they would not match. That's why we have things like Cinematch. That's why I designed the owl color picture profiles and the owl color LUTs, was in that case to match your camera to the Alexa, because the sensor sees color differently. The color space transform doesn't know what your intent was or what the camera saw in that sense. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Color space transforms are mathematical. They're not artistic, and they don't match cameras. Now, one thing that is nice to do is you want all of your cameras to be in the same color space and gamut or gamma when you are coloring, so that you can treat everything in the same manner. But that doesn't inherently make them look the same. So what I will do is, you know, if let's say I was shooting Alexa next to my C500 in Resolve, I will do a color space transform into DaVinci wide gamut and DaVinci wide gamma, whatever, the Resolve wide gamut, because it's a very wide color space for which to work within, and then kick out, you know, so you could have 100 cameras, but you're editing them all in DaVinci wide gamut, so that all of your tools operate the same way. Does that make sense? It's not like a color thing, it's a workflow thing. Okay, similar to a CST not being instant RE, a speed booster doesn't make your camera full frame. I think I think this has to be the biggest myth out of all the myths. A speed booster does not make your camera full frame. A full frame camera, a full frame sensor is a bigger sensor, and it gives you technical advantages. Using a full frame lens squeezed onto a smaller sensor does not give you the technical advantages that a full frame sensor gives you. You might be thinking, oh, but I get the depth of field of that lens. No, because you're putting an optical element behind the lens, you are physically, literally changing that lens into another lens. So if you had your 50 millimeter lens on a speed booster, which actually they're called focal reducers. Speed booster is a name that is trademarked by that company that makes speed boosters. Focal reducer. That maybe this will make more sense. So you have your 50 millimeter full frame lens on a focal reducer. You are literally changing that lens into a 33 and a half or something, 35 and a half millimeter lens. It's times 0.71. And therefore you are getting the depth of field of that new lens. And also depth of field is, this is where it gets really nitpicky. Depth of field depends on f-stop and depends on distance to camera, right? So it doesn't, like, if you put squeezing that 50 millimeter focal length onto a smaller sensor doesn't instantly inherently give you a full frame look, which isn't even really a look to begin with. All it is, hold on. I have the CineLens manual over here, but I'm not going to dig it out. Buy the CineLens manual. What you are doing is you are allowing yourself to see the full character of your lens by using a focal reducer. So, you know, if the edges are kind of interesting, you know, you're shaping that character in. You are gaining a little bit of light performance because, you know, kind of like a magnifying glass, you know, you're focusing more photons in on. So you get a better, I suppose, T-stop, but not a shallower depth of field for any given scenario. right? The advantages to a full frame sensor are, yes, you have a different lens choice, but I wouldn't say a better or more cinematic or anything. You get to see the full character of certain lenses, but it's mostly the physical resolution of that sensor, the more space that light is being transmitted onto, that gives you smoother tones and gradations and the appearance of a higher resolution, sharper, but softer look. That's what a full frame camera gives you, a full frame sensor. But full frame lenses don't inherently have any quality that putting them on a focal reducer will then be imbued into that smaller sensor. And in fact, like I said, you are literally changing that longer lens into a shorter lens because you're adding an optic behind it, right? So, yeah, speed boosters, focal reducers, they're just extra pieces of glass that make your lens, your field of view wider, and you get a little bit more light transmission. That's it. I'm sure there's going to be arguments in the comments. I've talked about this before and people have told me to test it. It's really easy. I've spoken to the experts, the guys who wrote the literal book on it. You're wrong. And finally, in these same kind of areas, cinema lenses aren't inherently better. I've seen a lot of videos of like, oh, I upped my game. I got these cheap Chinese cinema lenses, which a lot of them are great, optically, and they do their job fine. I'm not poo-pooing the cinema lenses themselves. I'm just saying that cinema lenses in general aren't better optically. If you're a solo shooter, like if I'm shooting just by myself and it's not like something super creative, I'm using autofocus. If within reason. Sometimes autofocus gets away with it and you got to do it manually, or you're shooting high speed and you gotta. But some cameras don't. My C500 doesn't allow autofocus in high speed. Whatever. The point of a cinema lens is to allow a crew to operate it and maybe give it a little more robustness. Larger companies that have made cinema lenses, your Ari, Panavision, Cook, those cinema lenses are designed in such a way to minimize breathing, to enhance clarity or enhance the look inherent. Cook kind of has a look, whereas the Master Primes from Ari have like no look. The most expensive cinema lenses correct out. Usually it's like focus breathing. They'll try to really smooth out the bokeh. Oftentimes, unless it's like a vintage optic, which even some of the, it depends. Each lens is different, but just saying, "Ooh, I bought a new set of cinema lenses and stepped my game up," isn't a thing. What it means is now you've lost autofocus and manual and stabilization, and now you have to do everything handheld. Like there's 3 gears on there for your first AC, and now you're your own first AC, and you got to not, in a cinema lens, generally the aperture isn't clicked, doesn't have like stops, so it's real smooth. So you got to watch out for that when you're hand holding it. If you're doing, cinema lens solo, the focus throw is going to be a lot longer, which in many cases is helpful, but in many cases can be annoying if you got to do quick focus pulls. And obviously the zoom, if there is one, it's a zoom. There's not really anything different there. But moral story, cinema lenses tend to have higher build quality, tend to be measured in T-stops, meaning transmission stops instead of f-stops. Transmission stops means it's measured the light, that much light, T2.8 means that there's 2.8 amount of light coming through the lens. F2.8 means that the aperture is a certain size, which is going back to focal reducers, speed boosters. You are, because you're putting a lens after the aperture, changing the aperture, which is why your given depth of field can change. Anyway, so cinema lenses, better build quality, T-stops instead of f-stops, longer focus throw, hopefully corrected for focus breathing, declicked aperture, and yeah, generally built for a crew. So that's it. That's the myth busting for this evening. I hope that was informative. If you have any other questions about myths or things you're not quite sure about, feel free to ask them below. I will answer them or do the research or whatever. I've written for Pro Video Coalition for 8 years. At this point, I have to accept that I'm a journalist. So I'll do my journalism and answer your questions. But yeah, that's it for me. I hope that was informative, and thank you for watching.